the recording of Chapter 7, Equipment and Process Standards. This chapter recording tracks the Methane Abatement Handbook. Thanks to our guest speaker for joining us today, Casey Michaels, who's legal counsel with the International Energy Agency based in Paris. Casey is also one of the contributing authors for this handbook. The handbook text can be found at the website, linked on this slide, so do encourage you all to take a look at that. While several of the topics in Chapter 7 will be covered in this recording, the handbook is a much deeper resource if you have any questions. I also want to thank our funder and supporter for all of this work, as well as the handbook, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources, as well as the several other institutional contributors. With that, Casey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Priya. So this video will look at equipment and process standards. This is part of 3 chapters that look at different regulatory strategies and solutions. Chapter 5 on LDAR, Chapter 6 on flaring and venting, and now this one on equipment and process standards. What does this really mean? So these are in addition to methane from fugitive sources and from deliberate flaring or venting, there are cases where methane can be emitted from equipment that's used in the oil and gas sector as a result of the design of that equipment or per the operating standards. So just for example, there are cases where there are pneumatic controllers that are run essentially every time that they operate, they use a little bit of the pressure from the gas to operate a valve. And so in doing so, some of the gas is released into the equipment and eventually into the atmosphere. So this is just part of the design of the equipment. It is a known emission source. Typically, the operator will know that it is there and know that it releases a certain set of emissions, a certain amount of emissions. So the regulatory tool is designed to require operators to use certain types of equipment or follow certain process standards, which can lead to reduced emissions. But typically, in many cases, the regulation will require companies to replace older, high-emitting equipment with newer alternatives that emit low amounts or no emissions at all. And they also sometimes can require specific procedures that help to reduce emissions. There are many examples of this type of standard, this type of regulation in the oil and gas sector that cover many different types of equipment, like these things like well completions, pneumatic devices. And in this video, we'll also spend a little bit of time looking at Nigeria, which is a case study from their 2022 regulation that's covered in the handbook. Some of the key features of equipment and process regulations. These are usually quite targeted regulations. We call them command and control or prescriptive regulations, and they require very specific behavior. So for example, for pneumatic devices, they will tell companies, you must replace this device with a lower emitting device, or they will say if you're developing a new site, you have to use devices that that have a certain amount of emissions and no more. There are certain other types of activities like well completions, liquids unloading, and various processes. They can specify any company that's undertaking, say, a pipeline blowdown needs to follow certain procedures to ensure that the amount of methane that is emitted is as low as possible. There are different types of these. There are prescriptive, purely prescriptive, which simply may just ban the use of a specific device. And there are performance-based equipment standards that set a required level of performance. So for example, instead of saying pneumatic controller of this model is banned, you could say all pneumatic controllers must emit less than 0.17 standard cubic meters per hour. That allows companies to select what product option that might be the cheapest. It also encourages companies to develop better alternatives in the future. Some of the key questions for regulators and the key design features that need to be discussed include the coverage. So a lot of regulations distinguish between large and small sources or provide other types of distinction related to cost or feasibility of compliance. For example, equipment that's used in very remote sources where there's limited or no access to regular electricity or grid electricity might have a different requirement from those that are located close to grid electricity. Another consideration is on monitoring. So it's really important important to ensure that emissions reductions are actually achieved, and what can governments do to ensure that the equipment and processes are actually taken. So some countries have required inventories. So essentially a company must report on, say, pneumatic devices. They say, this is the number that we have, these the model numbers, this is their emissions rate, this is how often they've been inspected. Similarly, they may have to report on certain types of processes that take place, like well completions. And often some regulations even require a third-party certification to ensure that that data is reliable and that it's been reported correctly. So in the handbook, we have a case study of Nigeria's equipment standard regulations, which were issued in 2022, that established specific standards for different types of equipment. And these are really good examples of how these can work. So for example, on the left side, we have there some details about Nigeria's law or regulation on liquid storage tanks. The regulation directly requires operators to implement, they have a choice, either a vapor recovery system or a combustion device as a flare for tanks that meet a certain size threshold. So that is based on size. So very small tanks don't have this requirement, but only very large ones do. So that is a decision point that the Nigeria regulators took based on the likelihood and expected size of emissions. So there is also a limitation on coverage for those that have the potential to emit more than 2 tons per year of volatile organic compounds. But it's just another example of the types of decision point that governments need to make to ensure or to set when they set these standards. On the right side, we have a little bit of info about their pneumatic controllers requirement, which similarly has a prescriptive requirement that companies must replace or retrofit high emitting devices with low or zero emitting devices. It also disallows natural gas driven pneumatic controllers that vent gas directly to the atmosphere for many different types of facilities. Similar to liquid storage tank, there are some decisions that had to be made about coverage. It applies to all compressor stations and processing plants, including existing, no matter what age they are. But for well production facilities, it only applies to new construction. But there is a decision point here for regulators to decide on, do we want to reach all possible sources, or do we want to limit those that might have a more complicated economic payoff? And the one last thing I would emphasize about this type of standard, and there's more details about this in the handbook, is that these don't require detailed knowledge about emissions levels and high quality quantitative reporting. If we know that equipment A emits more than equipment B, if we require companies to replace the equipment, upgrade the equipment, then we know that emissions should come down. This is important that while we, on the one hand, do need to improve the level of monitoring and understanding about emissions sources and data, that doesn't mean we can't take certain actions to reduce emissions, essentially today. And with that, I think I'll close this one. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Casey. And again, if you have any other questions on this chapter, please do take a look at the handbook. Thanks again to our funder for all of this work, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources.